Thank you to the Transnational Institute, the NOTAP movement, and Mark Neoclaus for inviting me to this workshop. Today, I'm presenting a small slice of a much larger research project on a series of interagency intelligence hubs in the United States called fusion centers. These intelligence centers bring together state and local police with federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies. While they were ostensibly set up for counterterrorism purposes, they have quickly shifted towards an amorphous all crimes, all threats, all hazards orientation. In the United States, there are now 79 of these fusion centers recognized by the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. They join 190 other intelligence task forces that have been put in place by the various arms of the federal government since the 1970s. While the United States has a uniquely overdeveloped domestic intelligence apparatus, the fusion center model has spread to Europe. In my understanding, the Committee of Counterterrorism Strategic Analysis is the closest Italian analog to what we call fusion centers. Given that this workshop is oriented around the struggle to block the construction of the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, my comments today will focus on the role fusion centers have played in the pacification of pipeline struggles in the U.S. So specifically, I'm going to make 4 points. One, I will briefly explain how political policing changed in the United States since the 1970s. I will relate these changes to wider processes of state formation, what I term as the transition from the Herrenfolk welfare state to the workfare carceral state. 3, I will detail the role of fusion centers in the fight over the Dakota Access Pipeline. And then 4, I'll conclude with some implications for contemporary movements. So in the United States, all conversations about political policing happen in the shadow of COINTELPRO, the infamous counterintelligence program to pacify social movements directed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the principal federal law enforcement agency in the U.S. So COINTELPRO lasted from 1956 to 1971. It was an incredibly successful pacification program. It is implicated in the breakup of major organizations and coalitions. Its impact is not lost on contemporary observers. Indeed, the specter of COINTELPRO, to quote the subtitle of one recent report on fusion centers, still haunts the politics of the United States. The term specter, however, is an apt one. COINTELPRO is dead. It may haunt the politics of the United States, but the COINTELPRO model does not characterize political policing today. COINTELPRO was uniquely centralized. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director from 1924 to 1972, personally directed COINTELPRO and reviewed every operation. On several occasions, FBI special officers in charge wanted to discontinue a program area because specific movement categories, such as New Left or Black Power, did not exist in their jurisdiction. Hoover never approved any of these requests. The centralization of COINTELPRO was also its undoing. When activists exposed it, the paper trail clearly implicated Hoover. Fusion centers, in contrast, are decentralized. While they are recognized by DHS, they are managed by municipal or state police and operationally independent from DHS. Fusion center directors work within a loose framework of recommendations and baseline capabilities. In this environment, fusion centers tailor their services to the unique needs of their local partners. So for political policing, this arrangement creates a range of potential outcomes. In the pacification of Occupy Wall Street, an example I discuss at length in the related book, some encampments were crushed by the iron hand of police repression, and others were swept away with the velvet glove of negotiated management. These divergent outcomes reflect the specificities of the state apparatus. So COINTELPRO was a product of what I call the Heron Folk welfare state, a term I use to explain the dynamics of how racial and labor formation in the United States produced a weaker welfare state. A product of the era of monopoly capitalism contained largely within state borders, the centralized Heron Folk welfare state narrowed the state's response to political challenges as seen in the uniform aggressiveness of COINTELPRO. In contrast, fusion centers are a constitutive component of the contemporary work for a carceral state, a term I use to capture the pairing of economic liberalization and carceral expansion in the US since the 1970s. As a reflection of increasingly globalized capital and the related extension of commodification and competition to all aspects of life, the work for a carceral state has reorganized all aspects of government, including police forces, around market models. So the resultant decentralization opens specific instances of political policing to local political pressures. So private interests, not politicians or government officials, appear to be the leading actors in some of the most notorious examples of political policing, like the crackdown on Occupy or the showdown over the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. In this way, political policing in the United States is not the new COINTELPRO. Instead, it represents a return of the Pinkertons, the notorious private detective agency that industrialists and railroad barons hired to defeat labor militants in the late 19th century. So the pacification of the mobilization against the Dakota Access Pipeline, or DAPL, shows how fossil fuel interests and private security firms operated through fusion centers to defeat the mobilization and encourage other fusion centers to monitor similar campaigns against fossil fuel infrastructure. So in the spring of 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux began to organize against the DAPL, which would cut through their lands and endanger water supplies. The Water Protectors, as the protesters became known, assembled 3 encampments and launched direct actions to stop the construction. Numerous federal, state, and local entities, including North Dakota's Fusion Center, the North Dakota State and Local Intelligence Center, or ND-SLIC, created an intelligence group to provide real-time monitoring and a coordinated response. Importantly, Tiger Swan, a security contractor hired by Energy Transfer Partners, the firm building the pipeline to provide security on the construction site, also joined the task force. So best known for its work in US-occupied Iraq and Afghanistan, Tiger Swan quickly became the dominant force in the intelligence group. As documents obtained by journalists showed, Tiger Swan led the effort to pacify the protests. The security contractor went beyond monitoring and sought to exploit ongoing native versus non-native rifts and tribal rifts between peaceful and violent elements in order to delegitimize the anti-DAPL movement. Tiger Swan complemented these efforts with psychological warfare, euphemistically called a social engagement plan, to protect the reputation of DAPL. No mere public relations push, this work included arresting journalists and imposing a no-fly zone over the protest encampments. As the demonstrations continued, repression ratcheted up. In September, private security sicked dogs on protesters obstructing the bulldozing of a sacred site. In October, riot police used taser, pepper spray, beanbag rounds, and sound cannons to disperse a blockade that had stopped traffic for days. In the process, they arrested 127 demonstrators. In November, they sprayed protesters with fire hoses in below-freezing weather and shot tear gas and rubber bullets to clear protesters who were blocking a bridge. Over 300 people received treatment for hypothermia and 26 were hospitalized. These escalating confrontations punctuated the daily intelligence gathering. The camps were subject to aerial surveillance and penetrated by informants and infiltrators. In addition, ND-SLIC analysts trolled social media and mined databases to create reports that the intelligence group reviewed in daily meetings at the Emergency Operations Center in Bismarck, the state capital. One of these analyses was a network analysis that included Red Fawn Phallus, a water protector who was singled out by police and arrested in an October confrontation. During the arrest, officers wrestled Phallus to the ground, where they claim she fired 3 shots from a revolver. The owner of the gun, Heath Harmon, was a paid FBI informant that infiltrated the protest encampment and entered a romantic relationship with Phyllis. By the time security forces cleared the encampment in February 2017, the police had arrested nearly 500 protesters, 6 of whom, including Phyllis, faced felony charges. So fossil fuel interests continued to work through the Fusion Center network after the disruption of the anti-DAPL demonstration. Tiger Swan's pacification project grew into a multi-state dragnet. The security contractor monitored another protest encampment in Iowa and tracked 2 activists who sabotaged the pipeline in North Dakota and Iowa. After security forces cleared the encampments, they targeted what Tiger Swan called the anti-DAPL diaspora, monitoring other protests against pipeline constructions and demonstrations opposing the then incoming Trump administration in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, South Dakota, and Texas. These efforts were not without friction. One document noted that local law enforcement was not supportive of DAPL Security's mission because they were reluctant to arrest or cite trespassing individuals. Tiger Swan's leading role in the tensions between the security contractor and the hesitancy of some police agencies underscore the break with the COINTELPRO model. Fusion centers are not the center of political policing. They are a channel through which particular interests can flow. So in the case of DAPL, Tiger Swan called the water protectors terrorists and compared them to a jihadist insurgency. After the showdown at Standing Rock, Fusion Center analysts produced intelligence products that accepted Tiger Swan's basic analysis. For example, DHS jointly produced an intelligence report with Fusion Centers in Iowa, Illinois, North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, and Washington that detailed the targeting tactics and procedures used to pacify suspected environmental rights extremists. The ND SLIC collaborated with another DHS-recognized Fusion Center, the Central Florida Information Exchange, to draft an assessment on the impact of the anti-DAPL movement on the Sabal Trail pipeline, a natural gas conduit constructed in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida in 2016 and 2017. Fusion centers in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Tennessee also partnered with DHS to report on the threat of environmental rights extremists to the Diamond Pipeline, a project constructed in those 3 states in 2016 and 2017. So the showdown at Standing Rock and the subsequent diffusion of the pacification project through the Fusion Center network raises 3 points for the struggle here against the TAP. First, these struggles are iterative. Although I didn't have time to get into the details of this in this talk, the dynamics of contemporary political policing in the U.S. are shaped in large part by the reforms that followed the exposure of COINTELPRO. The showdown at Standing Rock, in turn, appears to have escalated efforts to pacify similar pipeline struggles, as the lessons of the anti-DAPL fight travel through the Fusion Center network. So the security apparatus has adopted and learned from these moments. Second, the iterative nature of these struggles means that the specific institutional arrangements surrounding any pacification project matters. So I don't know too much about the security apparatus of the European Union and its various member states. I did a little preliminary research, and I think the key security agencies to investigate would be the Committee of Counterterrorism Strategic Analysis here in Italy, the Intelligence and Situation Center that operates under the EU's European External Action Service. I think trying to determine the relationship between these entities and other police intelligence agencies in countries that the TAP is running through, like the State Security Division of the Hellenic Police in Greece, would be a worthy task. Of course, the role of private security also needs to be determined and investigated as well. Third, movement strategies themselves are also iterative. They build on themselves. So activists in the United States have been unable to block the construction of DAPL, the Keystone Pipeline, or any of these other pipelines with a combination of direct action, mass mobilization, and moral suasion. So in the context of the Trump administration, the mainstreaming of white supremacy, the street battles between Antifa and far-right organizations, the movements in the United States have radicalized. So we now have movements that are looking at examples like the fight of the Syrian Kurds or the Rojava Revolution, where there are efforts to create autonomous counterpower, green cooperative subsistence economies, and armed community self-defense. Right? So we can't take the examples we can't take models from one part of the world and transplant them to another without any calibration. But these examples do raise important questions that challenge us to move away from the liberal or social democratic reformism. So just to give one example, two recent organizations, the Socialist Rifle Association and Mutual Aid Disaster Relief in the United States, after Hurricane Florence, which hit South Carolina, they went to the area. They were armed to defend the community, not only against reactionary elements who were there to quote prevent looting, but they also were there to protect vulnerable communities against the state, to provide aid, to kind of show that the left has autonomous power, that we're here and able to help you defend against reactionary elements and provide services that the state may be unable to do. So these questions, these ideas put us in dangerous territory. But of course the danger is already here. So regardless of what humans decide to do, whether we transition to a post-carbon economy or not, the 21st century will be a time of abrupt and irreversible changes in the web of life. We can come up with plenty of clever arguments about how security works to suppress change and administer a world remade by capital. But if we want humanity to survive this century, we will have to politically confront security. So as someone who's involved in the movements that I study, I found the concept of pacification to be very helpful in thinking of the limitations of existing movements and the challenges that are placed before us. So I hope this intervention and this workshop can make similar contributions to your movements and your struggles. So thank you.